is the Danger Close podcast, Beyond the Books with me, Jack Carr. Welcome to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by 6 Hour. My guest today is my friend, Dr. David Kilcullen. David is a former Australian Army officer who managed to get a PhD in political anthropology along the way. He was the advisor on counterinsurgency to Condoleezza Rice at the State Department and to David Petraeus during the surge in Iraq. Today, he runs a strategic advisory firm and has written 5 books. And if you've been paying attention, you will notice his influence in each and every one of my novels. In particular, this last one, In the Devil's Hand. His latest novel, The Dragons and the Snakes, which I read back in early 2020, really helped lay a lot of that foundation for what I was writing in The Devil's Hand. So without further ado, my friend, Dr. David Kilcullen. David Kilcullen, thank you so much for jumping on. I'm so excited to get to talk to you. And you know what? The secret of this podcast, the why I started it, is so that we could have this conversation, because we haven't talked to each other in so long. So you essentially forced me, with all the different little apps and stuff like that we have to communicate through when you're traveling all around the world doing your thing. I had to actually start a podcast so we could catch up. So that's why I'm doing the whole thing.
I think the last time we had a drink together, you were still a Navy SEAL. So that was a while ago. And
that was a while ago.
Happened since then. Yeah.
It's been busy. And I think the last time we were talking seriously about things was when I was in South Africa with a mutual friend of ours. And I was going down there to help train up an anti-poaching unit. They were transitioning over to M4s and Glocks, which are 2 platforms that I have some experience with. And you were talking to him about something. And so we got to catch up a little bit there, but then it was off to the races with,
but you really haven't looked back, mate. I mean, it's a testament to your discipline and the fact that people are interested in what you have to say. It's fantastic.
Well, I've certainly appreciated it.
I have to say, I honestly have no idea how you write fiction, man. It's so much harder than nonfiction. And I've always looked up to guys that can actually pull that together. Because, as I always say, nonfiction only has to be true, but fiction has to be believable, right? Which is different.
This is true. And it's getting harder and harder to do that, because if you were to write about some of the things that are actually happening today, 10 years ago, people would think it was science fiction. People wouldn't believe it. You would have been asking your reader to suspend their disbelief too many times. I think in fiction, you get away with it once. If you're writing like political thriller type things, you can get away with it once. They'll take that leap with you. But if you continue to do it throughout a whole book 4 or 5 times, they're not going to stick with you. So,
that's totally true.
But today there's so much craziness. Over the last year and a half, so much has happened that,
if you just wrote a straight history of 2020 and tried to pass it off as fiction, a lot of people would have gone, it's just barely believable that all that stuff would have happened in 1 year.
I know. It's crazy. It's crazy. And then so I did a quick prep for this because I've been reading your stuff for so long. Before we knew each other, before we were friends, I knew who you were. I was reading all your stuff every chance I got with the books, articles, online, anything I could find. I was trying to just devouring it as a combat leader, because I thought that was my responsibility as a leader, to be able to make those decisions either under fire or even in garrison in preparation for impacting the battlefield. That's what I owed my guys. I had to be a student of history, student of insurgencies, of counterinsurgencies, of terrorism, warfare in general. But I grabbed the books off the shelf before before we jumped on here, and I opened this one because I did a little skim. So here I have all my notes and stuff. There's this one, Accidental Guerrilla. I opened this one and it's like all yellow. The whole thing is highlighted. So it's like, I shouldn't have even used a highlighter, because the whole thing is highlighted in there.
I think you were reading that one when you were in the Philippines, right?
That's right. Exactly.
You were in the middle of that very interesting deployment and whipped up on the basis of that. Yeah, that was a while ago.
That's exactly right. Because that was the first time I really had time to take a breath and kind of process what I'd been doing for the previous 9 years, essentially, which was what any large city SWAT team does every night in Los Angeles, in Albuquerque, in Chicago, wherever, serving warrants type thing, kicking indoors, grabbing somebody, bringing them out, trying to get intelligence from them in order to go get somebody else. And essentially these different IED networks and all the rest of it, they looked like what I had seen in movies of police in the United States putting together crime families or something like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Who's connected to who, who's talking to who, all of that stuff. So
Like
in the Philippines was the first time where I could actually study this, take a breath and say, hey, I could do this forever in Kabul, in Mosul, in Baghdad, in Ramadi, wherever. And I could continue to do this for 30, 40, 50 years. That's the first time that I really took a breath and dove into this study. And that's exactly when you published Accidental Guerrilla. So that whole thing is all you, but I wanted to, so I opened this and I read page 16, Dragons and the Snakes, which is your latest book.
Yeah.
And as I was reading through, I'm like, oh my goodness, I completely forgot that I got the almost exact wording for the start of The Devil's Hand, which is very academic in nature, from this, because I did so much research for this. There was a lot of academic research involved in The Devil's Hand. The other ones, not nearly as much, but I didn't have any background really in bioweapons or that sort of thing when I started writing this. But I read this and talking about the authorization for the use of military force, which I have in the novel. And then I read this part, 19 years later, this 275-word resolution passed by Congress only 7 days after 9/11, and with only 2 abstentions in the Senate and a single nay in the House, remains the sole legal basis for an ongoing worldwide forever war. So anyway, I took almost that exact wording and put it in the beginning of The Devil's Hand. And I didn't realize with all where I had got it until about an hour ago when I just pulled this off the shelf. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Yeah.
And for people who have read all your novels and all mine, they will find even in all the other novels, but right here, I read it right here. 7 days after 9/11, Congress passed it. So almost exactly word for word.
Yeah, that's what happened.
So thank you so much for that. But I remember I went to the resolution, I copied and pasted it. I did the word count. I made sure, because everybody can fact check you these days and there's no, there's no barriers. So thank you so much for that. And for people that have read both of our stuff, so much of what I've learned from you ends up in the pages of my novels, because my protagonist has a background similar to mine, and that just comes across. And so a lot of me is in that character. And because of how much respect I have for you and how much I've learned from you over the years, that just comes across in the novel. So
I appreciate you saying that, man. But I'll give you two areas of kudos. One is, you are the door kicker with the experience doing that. I obviously did different stuff. But also, like, seriously, the ability to take dry nonfiction facts and weave them into a historically accurate but still engaging narrative. Like, very few people can do that. Every nonfiction author thinks they can write a novel, and every publisher's like, dude, no. And so, kudos to you, man. And I'm a great fan of your books, and I often sort of chuckle when I read something. I'm like, I remember that incident in a slightly non-fictionalized form. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah, there's a few of them in that first one. Crosscut targeting made it into the first novel in a sentence or two in there. So I guess there's so much of what I learned from you became a part of me that a lot of times it's almost like I'm so far behind, I think I'm first. I've heard that terminology, like you're out there in the front, and some of these things I've been studying for so long that I almost think that I came up with them when in fact, they're all you. So thank you for that.
I'm going to give you a blanket endorsement right now to use any of my stuff that you want. No need to put in a footnote or anything.
You're in the back. You're in all the acknowledgments, of course, and all the rest of it. But before we get to Dragons and the Snakes and all the rest of this stuff, for people that might not be familiar with your background, how did you get up to the point, of Dragons and Snakes, but really up to the 28 articles? Like, where did you from Australian military up through that time frame, 2006, 2007 time frame? What was that path like for you?
Yeah, well, the great question for those that aren't in our business. To explain my accent, right? I'm an American now, but I'm Australian by background, and was in the Australian military. And the way that it worked back in the 80s when I graduated from the academy was that everyone had to do an Asian language. And I did my sort of language test and tested out fairly high. So I just finished my platoon command, and the Army's like, right, you're going to language school. I was like, oh, Jesus. So I ended up going to language school. I did Indonesian, ended up being trained to do what we call security force assistance or foreign internal defense. So working with a foreign military that has a threat and helping them to sort of get a grip of it. And so I went out as a young captain in the 90s all over Indonesia working with the Indonesians. And at that point, it was pretty quiet. It was a military dictatorship at that point. We had yet to see the democratization that's been really amazing in Indonesia in the last 20 years or so. But I became pretty quickly aware that there was this entire Islamic extremist separatist organization that had existed in the 50s and 60s and arguably still existed in Indonesia that had never really been written about, in the academic world. And I had just started my PhD on political anthropology. So I sort of pitched the army on, I'd like to do this study of Islamic extremism and terrorist insurgency. And the army was like, no, why are you doing that? It's irrelevant. It's post-Cold War environment. Under what possible circumstances would we ever fight, Islamic insurgents? So anyway, eventually I talked them into it and they let me do it, but they never gave me a day off or a dollar. I just did it all on my own time while, commanding a company, and I was S3 of equivalent to a Ranger battalion and doing all that stuff. But then 9/11 happened. And immediately, people probably remember just after 9/11, there was a big spike of activity in Indonesia. And in October of 2002, there was really big terrorist bombing on the island of Bali that actually killed more Australians proportionally by population than 9/11 killed Americans. And it really engaged the government very heavily in, okay, we've got to do something about this. And everyone's like, does anyone know anything about these guys? And then the army were like, oh, yeah, we have a guy, right?
Well, so where's that guy we told not to do that PhD program?
They're like, suddenly I was like their, the son of their prescient genius. And look, I'm fine with that. So I went off. I was about to command a battalion, but got sort of sidetracked and ended up in the intelligence community, helping to respond to the Bali bombing. But it was also early days of Afghanistan and Iraq. And after about a year or so, I wrote a paper essentially saying, look, the Iraq war is killing us, right? It's making more terrorists than we can kill. It's generating this kind of cascading set of effects globally that are just making things a lot worse. And we must get a grip of Iraq or everything else is just pointless. And a guy called Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon at the time, read that and sort of wrote to the Aussies and said, hey, can we borrow Dave to come and help, work on there's this thing called the QDR, the Quadrennial Defense Review. Every 4 years, the Pentagon has to put together a sort of strategic review for Congress. So they brought me over for that. I ended up getting seconded to the US State Department, Counterterrorism Bureau. From there, I ended up being working on the counterinsurgency manual, which people were building at the time, and a general called David Petraeus, who was in charge of the Command and Staff College out at Leavenworth, was writing that. And then he got the gig to command Multinational Force Iraq and asked the Aussies if he could have me to come with him. And I ended up sort of in there advising around the surge in 2007. I often get misdescribed as Petraeus' advisor, right? Petraeus didn't need any advice on counterinsurgency. I mean, he literally wrote the book on it. My main job was to be out on the ground with the Iraqi units and our guys, and basically sort of like an on-field coaching job, helping people figure out, okay, this is how we've been doing it. This is the new construct, and how do we change what we're doing? And about halfway through that was when the awakening happened, right? The Sahwa, where the Iraqi Sunni tribes, and you remember this from your own time there, right, turned against Al-Qaeda. And, people like to put a lot of credit on the counterinsurgency doctrine and the extra troops and all that. That's all true. But the real decisive thing in Iraq was the awakening. And if that hadn't happened, we would have been defeated there, 15 years ago. Of course, we managed to snatch success from the jaws of defeat, and then, lost it again in a year or two when we decided to pull out and just let it all go to hell. And then we had to do it all over again with ISIS. So anyway, that's how I got into what I'm doing now. I left the government in 2010, started a firm called Cordillera that does this stuff in Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia. And we do a lot of other stuff too. But that's my sort of core expertise, is helping people deal with, let's say, complex social problems while getting shot at.
Yeah.
It's probably a good summary. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. What's always impressed me so much about you is that you have that tactical level experience and you have that strategic level experience, and you can speak at both levels. And very few people can do that. Some people talk at that strategic level, the people that they're talking to at the tactical level know they've never done anything down there, know that their touch point down here was like 1987 exercise, in Germany or something like that. And
and there's a lot of stuff where people have something that briefs well on PowerPoint, but it doesn't necessarily work on the ground. Yeah. I like to say reality is tactical, right? So you can be as strategic as you like, but unless you understand what it looks like, how it works, what's going through a guy's head as he's kicking that door down, then you're possibly harming people by coming up with these ideas that, seem like a good idea, but don't necessarily work in practice. So I always like to, field test everything with guys like you, but others that do the business, and I like to do the business myself whenever I can. Yeah. Because that's the only way you stay current,
Yeah, no, you're amazing. And what I love about these is that every now and again, you give a glimpse of some of those really cool personal stories that you have that I know about because we've talked, but there's not an autobiography type thing yet. And that would be amazing at some point because there's so many touch points in all of these where I'm like, oh, I want to know more about that. Or I remember when we talked about that over drinks and that would make a great story. There's some great lessons there. But so were the 28 articles, was that, so here's the counterinsurgency field manual right here. Manual. Were those born of this? Because this was maybe, what was the, I mean, they all came from you, but was this too strategic in nature for that person that's out there that's just has a few minutes before he goes out on patrol and someone hands him this book in 2007? And they're like, well, how's this supposed to?
I think they put the 28 articles in as appendix to that, but it had already been published by the Marine Corps Review. In fact, that counterinsurgency manual, the first one, FM 324 of 2006, was a real group effort of a lot of super smart people. And I was sort of involved in it and I helped with it, but, I wasn't one of the major authors because I was busy, in Iraq, right? But it certainly, it's worth a read even now because it captures a lot of the core ideas. But no, 28 articles came about because of a really smart couple of Marine Corps captains. I'm sitting in my office in the State Department one day in the Counterterrorism Bureau. There's a knock on the door and these two guys come in. One's a guy called by the name of Scott Cuomo. There's a couple others. And they say, look, we're instructing out at Quantico and we've seen all of this sort of higher level strategic stuff about, how to achieve various high level goals in counterinsurgency. What it doesn't give you is the concrete detail of like how to do it. Mm-hmm. And would you be willing to kind of, give us some pointers on that? And as it happened, I had to go to a meeting that afternoon in the Pentagon. And the guy I was supposed to meet stood me up. He had another meeting come up. That happens. So I ended up sitting in a Starbucks near the Pentagon with like 2 hours to kill. Didn't want to go back to the State Department, So I pulled out a little black notebook and I just started writing down all my sort of key points that I would have told those Marine captains about how to think about what to do. And I organized it in sort of chronological order. Happened to be 28 points. And for people in my business, there's a famous article by T.E. Lawrence called the 27 Articles, right? Which is his description of how to do guerrilla warfare against the Turks in World War I. And I'm like, I have 28. So I said, I'm
I win.
28 articles, a little homage to T.E. Lawrence. Not that I'd ever be in his category, but, just to kind of, link it. So a lot of guys read 27 articles by Lawrence with 28 articles by me. And I'm like, well, I'm honored to be in the same company. But, he actually, had an amazing history in World War I. But I'd argue you should read probably both together. But yeah, that's how it came about. And I went home from that Starbucks and I basically drank about half a bottle of Lafroig that night, stayed up till about 2 a.m, just wrote it up, on my computer and sent it out. And originally it was an email. And it just sort of went around like sort of samized out around the Army captains and around the Marine Corps. And then I get this call from the Marine Corps Review and they're like, hey, can you write that up as an article? So I ended up putting it out, I guess, April 06 maybe. So about a year and a bit before the coin manual came out and about a year before the surge. And I think it's funny because you put a lot of work into books, right? But sometimes it's the thing that you chunk out, in one night
Yeah.
with a half a bottle of whiskey that is most resonant. And part of it is because it's practical, right? It's like, here's what you do first, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then do this, think about this, try to kind of give people a how-to guide. But I also tried to caveat it to say, like, this is what I know from the campaigns I've done. When you get out on the ground, this is only ever going to be a very rough guide, and you got to figure it out for yourself, right? And that's a message that I think has resonated with a lot of people over the years. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's hard to believe. That's years ago now.
Yeah, I know. It's crazy how time is flying. And here it's captured here in counterinsurgency, right there. Oh, I think you can see it right there. But this is fantastic.
Yeah, well, my books, I don't know what's going on. I have to get my publisher to send you a crate of whiskey.
Please, hey, I won't turn it down. But this one, so I put these on my the professional reading list that I was asked to put together before I left the military for the Naval Special Warfare Center. I don't know if they actually implemented it or not, but I put all those books that had impacted me and the ones that I'd recommended over the years to junior officers, to chiefs, to anybody that expressed an interest, and turn that into this professional reading list right here. And all your books, of course, a couple of them weren't out then when I was back in the military, but all these books are required reading as far as I'm concerned for any student of warfare, whether they're going to be a practitioner of that, or they're going to be a policymaker, or they're going to be sending out a tweet on this subject that's going to be read by one person or 10 million people. Doesn't matter. These are absolutely fantastic right here. And jumping back to David Petraeus really quickly, there was something that happened in, I think it was Afghanistan in 2011, where you got your hands on an Al-Qaeda after action report that described you as Petraeus's Australian mercenary.
That's right. It was actually a report from Iraq.
Okay.
People were sort of passing it around, and it's interesting, right? Because we think about terrorists as being, on the one hand, you think of them as sort of depraved psychos, which is actually not true most of the time, and then we also tend to think of them as kind of 10 feet tall evil geniuses. And the truth is, what they are is a learning organization that's continually adapting to a really hostile environment, and people that don't adapt fast enough die. So, it's sort of combat Darwinism, right? And the guys we're fighting 20 years into the war on terrorism, by definition, the smart and the lucky and the cunning and the adaptive guys are still out there, and the stupid and unlucky are dead. So they put a lot of effort into adaptation and lessons learned, much as a professional military organization does. And basically one of my analysts found this thing and was like, hey, look at this. And basically it was an after-action review by a group in Iraq about why they lost during the surge, and talking about the different elements that made it hard for them to operate, and then recommending some ideas for the Afghan Taliban and others about how to react to the US surge in Afghanistan, which was about to happen. So it's a classic example of cross-pollination of information amongst different groups, and about how really the common feature here is that they're learning, they're adapting all the time. This stuff never stays still. And again, back to your earlier point, that's why you have to be in the field all the time and stay current, because stuff that you did a week ago or 2 weeks ago is out of date. And by definition, if something works once, it's a lot less likely to work, a second or a third or a 10th time. And yeah, they described me as Petraeus as Australian mercenary. I'm like, no, I'll take that.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. I like that one.
It's always what the enemy says about you. That's most honest. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. We should frame that one. I think it was an unclassified, because they just put that out there on their channel. So that's a good one to frame. I love it. That's fantastic. But yeah, I found that also that obviously it's important to be anything, whether it's military or business, whatever, to be a learning organization. And on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan, the enemy could adapt a little quicker than we could, because we are still, even in special operations, we were a bureaucracy. And they could.
I remember, just to tell a brief story, during the Battle of Amaria, which is in June of 2007 in downtown Baghdad, great cavalry officer by the name of Dale Cool had the district of Amaria. And as part of that battle, he ended up working with local guys who were fighting Al-Qaeda. And one of the big issues, as you know, was figuring out how to tell the guys that were working with us from the other Iraqis who are also in civilian clothes, also carrying the same weapons, fighting in the same area. So one of these units got, those reflective sashes that Army guys wear when they go running.
Yeah. Yes, I heard that you don't have to do that on some bases anymore. I actually wrote that into my last novel.
Really?
I did. Yeah, I know. But point being, I know those reflective vests.
Yeah,
yes.
and so they basically cut them up into little reflective squares, and they got them to stick them on their backs. So they had like some means of sort of telling them apart. This happened at like maybe 8 p.m. By dawn the next day, all the Al-Qaeda guys had them too. Right? Wow. Within one night, they found out about it, figured out what's going on, fabricated their own, got them out there, and before the sun comes up, Al-Qaeda's doing it too. That's how quick they were at adapting. And I would argue Islamic State, successor to AQI, is probably the most resilient and adaptive organization that I've ever encountered, friendly or enemy, right? And without in any way seeking to copy their methods, we could learn a lot from the way that they adapt, because as you said, we're slow. We're dinosaurs to their mammals,
Yep. No, exactly. I mean, they can pivot on a dime, it seems, particularly IED technology. As soon as we counter that, they're figuring out a way around it. That's that game of constant adaptation. And we're both looking for gaps in each other's defenses. We're both looking to capitalize on momentum and continually adapt faster, obviously, than.
And meanwhile, you've got great power actors like China and Russia and Iran to some extent looking at what we're doing and going, yeah, I'll take some of that. I'll take some of that. And they're copying from our methods, but also copying from our adversaries and sort of sitting to one side, letting us fight each other for the last 20 years and, exploiting that.
That became the basis for my fourth novel, what the enemy has learned by watching us on the field of battle for the last 20 years. And I always wanted to write something about that because I thought a lot about that during my time in uniform. I continued to think about that as a citizen, as an author, what the enemy's learning by watching, because we've been essentially playing poker for the last 20 years here, and they've been looking at our cards, seeing how we play those cards, taking notes, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't. That's a long period of time to be able to do that. And in the novel, I look at two distinctly different periods. I go back to about 1979 I go 1953 briefly, but 79 to 2001 onward. And I have some older characters that talking about Iran. Yeah. And had some characters that are older that grew up during that time in the 80s and early 90s. And hey, what did they learn during that time frame? And then what did they learn during that next period is when we're talking about terrorism, that different paradigm there. What do they learn in those two distinctly different periods? And that brings, to Dragons and the Snakes. I mean, point being, I wanted to always write about that. So it was in my wheelhouse. And then I talked to somebody in Argentina in 2017 who mentioned a few things about security pre 9/11 in airports and post 9/11 in airports. And I started thinking about those things. And then I figure, okay, now is the time to sit down and write this novel. And then that's right about the time that this came out. So early 2020, Dragons and the Snakes comes out and I'm reading it. And that really framed how I wanted to explore those themes in this fourth novel. And that's all due to you from the theme.
Not just me, mate. I mean, I know you get out and talk to a lot of people and you have a lot of your own field research too, but I'm happy to contribute a little bit. Yeah.
Well, no, it was fantastic. It really brought all that together for me as I started down the path of writing this. But when you say the Dragons and the Snakes, for those who haven't read the book, what are you talking about?
Well, it's actually not my phrase. It comes from Jim Woolsey, who was President Clinton's first CIA director. And when he was doing his confirmation hearing, so if you want to be the head of an agency and you get nominated by the president, you have to be approved by the Senate, and you go through a whole process for that. And when Woolsey was giving his confirmation testimony in February of 1993, so about maybe 15 months after the end of the Cold War, one of the people on the committee said, well, how do you see the next 10 years of sort of post-Cold War environment? And he said, we've slain a large dragon, talking about the Soviet Union. But now we find ourselves in a jungle filled with a bewildering variety of snakes. And in many ways, the dragon was easier to keep track of. So by dragon, he means, peer adversary, great power states with nuclear weapons, like the Soviet Union. By dragons, he goes on to talk about basically weak states, failing states, and non-state actors. So when I decided to write this book, the first person that I spoke to was actually Jim Woolsey, and I met with him a couple of times as I was writing the book. He's a fabulous guy. Very knowledgeable on all kinds of different ranges of threats. not shy about expressing his point of view, not in any way politically correct, it's very, very direct. And we had a great conversation about basically how we screwed it up, right? And how ideas that were pretty obvious to them in the 1990s, we somehow lost that during the war on terror. And basically the argument of the book is, for 10 years after the Cold War, from 91 to 2001, we focused on snakes, right? Weak states, non-state actors, failing states, Rwanda, Somalia, Liberia, all the stuff we did in the 1990s. After 9/11, we narrowed that focus to just one snake, international jihadist terrorism. And we had such a narrow focus that everybody else was able to adapt around us and do all that learning that we've just been talking about. Today, we're in like a post-Woolseyan environment where the dragons are back. China, Russia, to some extent, Iran and North Korea, but really China and Russia are back in a great power competition. I hear people saying we should avoid getting into a Cold War with the Chinese. Dude, we are already in a Cold War with the Chinese. We've been in one. They've been in one with us for years. We just have just started to wake up. And so what I wanted to show is how China, Russia, all of the terrorist organizations, Iran, the North Koreans, how they've learned in that period since Woolsey. So basically, I have a chapter where I talk a lot about non-state actors and how they learn, and I have a theory chapter, talking about application of a bunch of ideas from evolutionary theory, right, to how people adapt in a warfighting environment. And then I have a big long chapter on Russia, a big one on China, and shorter ones on Iran and North Korea. For the Russia chapter, I actually went up to the Arctic border between Norway and Russia.
That was fascinating. I wanted to take that and just do another book on that. I feel like I should not read when they come out, read them cover to cover. I should just pick a chapter and then start my next novel. Like just get a spark or something to explore and start that next chapter. But that was fascinating. Yeah. What inspired you to go up there as part of this research? Was there something that stuck out?
Yeah. So, a couple of things. One, I love the Norwegians. I don't know if you work with them much. But
I haven't, but I always wanted to. I missed that part.
Yeah. They're just fantastic. And for an army their size, of a nation their size, I'd say no one beats them in terms of quality, and particularly their special forces are just outstanding. And the Norwegians played a really big role in a number of the campaigns, obviously, since 9/11. I knew a bunch of guys from Afghanistan and elsewhere, and I'd been invited to go to Oslo to speak at a conference talking about the future of potential conflict with the Russians. And I was like, "Oh, come, and you don't have to pay me, of course, but I'll do a little contra deal. Take me up to the Russian border. There's a special unit up there. It's sort of like, elves running around at the border of Mordor, hanging out in the forest with the eye of Sauron looking at them. This tiny little unit, it's about 600 people, very elite. You're about 400 miles north of the Arctic Circle. It's all forest and swamp and tundra. And on the other side is basically the entire Russian Arctic, Northern Fleet, plus about 3 divisions of airborne troops and motor rifle troops. It's a huge amount of Russian firepower on the other side of this tiny little border. And half of it is water, so a little small boat type river, and half of it is forest. So I managed to go out with these guys for a few days and talk to them. They hide in these little OPs, keeping an eye on the Russians that are moving around by small boat. And I managed to ride about half the border on quad bike in the forest, right up to the edge of the border, like a couple of feet from Russia. What's astounding when you see that is how much gear the Russians have up there, right, in terms of like electronic attack, sophisticated aircraft. There's a whole nuclear submarine bastion up there, but they've also got like an entire brigade of VDV, so airborne troops that can like drop in with weapons. They got assault hovercraft. There's all this stuff out there. But also when you look at it, you realize that their border, even 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, is not designed to keep people out. It's designed to keep people in. So it's a very interesting sort of verdict on, modern Russia when you think about it. But the interesting thing about that area is there's a lot of Russian-speaking Norwegians. There are a lot of Norwegians who actually fought with the Russians against the Germans in World War II. People from if you've ever been to Norway, bring your own alcohol because it costs like a bomb to buy like a bottle of whiskey up there.
I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So people, and petrol too. So people drive across the border into Russia all the time to get vodka and gasoline, right?
Wow.
Meanwhile, Russians come into Kirkenes, which is the big town up there, to get diapers. For some reason, the Russian economy can't make a decent diaper even 30 years after communism, and to get aircraft flights to go to the rest of Europe. So there's a lot of cross-border traffic. There's intelligence activity goes on. There's cross-border movement. A few years ago, 5,000 Afghan and Middle Eastern refugees came across the border in basically 1-2 week period in this one little crossing point up there in the Arctic. And it's like, how did they get there? Well, they had help, and a lot of what the Russians have been doing to the Europeans and to us and to others, I think you can see that happening on the ground up in Norway. And again, I always like to make it concrete so people can have a visual, right? Yeah. And what are we actually talking about here? You can talk in sort of platitudes about the generic nature of it, but people, you can lose people in that. So I try to be as concrete as I can. I'll just say I'm not one of these people who believes that, President Trump was a Russian asset or that the Russians hacked the election. I don't think that's true. I don't think there's ever been any good evidence for it. What there is good evidence for is the Russians manipulated our political polarization with a technique they call reflexive control as a way of getting us to shout at each other so they could do all the things they wanted to do in places like Syria and Africa and Ukraine and elsewhere. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that sometimes we're our own worst enemies when we make these guys out to be, 10 feet tall and bulletproof. The Russians they have some serious weaknesses. And I think that equally goes for the Chinese. I didn't write about it very much. When I wrote the China chapter, I spent a bit of time out in New Guinea and out in the Pacific, various places in Southeast Asia and Latin America and Africa. And it's astounding how much the Chinese have expanded into that space. So we can talk about that if you want. But the Russian stuff I find fascinating. The Russians are a lot easier for us to understand than the Chinese are, I think, a lot of it.
No, I think you're absolutely right on that point. And that the few paragraphs that you have on why there was Russian meddling in an election, the distraction, all that stuff, the division that caused so they could do these other things. I mean, every single paragraph in these they're so good. There's so much value in every single sentence here. But for the country as a whole, to read those couple paragraphs that you have about that, I think would be so therapeutic for people that are at each other's throats about these things because they read an uninformed, tweet or an article that's meant to divide or manipulate. But I mean, that's everybody should read that for just those couple paragraphs. It's so valuable. It
is very sad what they've been able to do. And I think, I'm happy to be an American, but I just got here, right? And I don't really have an opinion on U.S. domestic politics. I try to focus on what I know well. But even I, looking at that, can see like, hey, this is totally, exaggerated and polarized for political gain, and it isn't helping the country. It's actually making things, a lot worse. Interestingly, if you go to somewhere like Ukraine or even Norway or Finland, what you see is that this technique of pitting people against each other is a classic Russian technique, and they do it all over the place, right? It's not unique to the US, and you don't need, a Russian asset in the White House. You just need, that's completely unnecessary, right? And I always, notice when everyone brings this up with Putin, he just laughs, right? He's not laughing out of some kind of like, wow, right. Dr. Evil. He's laughing at the sheer naivete of thinking that you actually need to do that. It's so easy to manipulate a modern democracy, just because of the way we operate.
Yeah, the way it is structured. But it's been over a year since I read Dragons and Snakes. But I didn't know about that Norwegian. I mean, I knew about Norwegian Involvement was Special Operations Executive and all that sort of thing in World War II. That's fascinating. But I didn't know about the Russian side of it on the Allied part. Like that was fast. I had no idea that was in there. I love that.
Russians, yeah, thousands of Norwegians went to the Soviet Union, came back and invaded northern Norway with the Russian army in 1945. And for most of the Cold War, the Norwegian government treated them like they were more or less criminals, right? I mean, guys that were in the Norwegian resistance against the Nazis on the Western side got medals and pensions and had movies made about them, Heroes of Telemark. Yep. And meanwhile, there's this whole other thing that went on up in the north. And, I've heard people say that you can still drive around up there, and those people are the descendants will like flip you the bird if you're a Norwegian, because they got screwed over.
Yeah.
Right? And they're loyal Norwegians,
right?
But they were treated like a fifth column for most of the Cold War. Now the Norwegian government, to its credit, remedied that after the Cold War.
Okay. It took a while.
It took a while. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that was fascinating. I hadn't studied that side of that. And I'm always very interested in special operations in general, and then that cold weather warfare side of it, particularly what happened up there during World War II.
That's definitely a growth area, right? I mean, you would have seen there's a lot of saber rattling going on in the Arctic. Russians have an incredibly aggressive approach to international waters and to the dominance of particular parts of territory up there. The Chinese have now had themselves declared a near Arctic power, which is kind of amusing because the closest they get to the Arctic is about roughly where Pittsburgh is, But they've had themselves declared that way. They've got icebreakers and all kinds of stuff going on. And then my own home command, Special Operations Command down in Australia, they're starting to focus very heavily on the Antarctic threat.
Yeah.
And the fact that I think we've all been used to running around deserts and cities for the last 20 years. That's going to continue. I wrote a whole book on urban warfare. I think that's definitely going to be the way of the future, but we're going to have to master some, let's call them special environments that we haven't had much to do with in the last 20 years. And one of those is definitely Arctic and cold weather.
Well, I think you just gave me my idea for it. See, I'm writing book 5 now. I have book 6 already outlined, so I know where it's going. I found that helps me, that I'm not wasting bandwidth worried about how I'm going to end one book and start another. So that's already done. But I think you've just given me an idea for book 7 or 8. So I'm going to have to dive into that a little more in depth.
Very Hemingway-esque of you, mate. Hemingway had this thing about you should never stop writing for the day till you know what you're going to say next.
There we go. That's perfect. And it does help because then I'm not worried. I'm not wasting that bandwidth and tiring myself out. But, talking about the domestic side of the house a little bit here. So in writing this novel about what the enemies learned by watching us, what are they incorporating into their future battle plans, all those things, I got to about October, November of 2020, and I ran into a problem because I put myself in the enemy's shoes from August of 2019 when I first outlined the book, started doing all this research into bioweapons, got into January, February, read your book, kind of narrowed things down a little bit, continued that research and writing throughout the year. And as I'm finishing up in October, November 2020, I realized, wow, if I was the enemy, I wouldn't do much right now. I would just kind of sit back and watch because we're doing a pretty good job of tearing ourselves apart from the inside out. And so I had to then figure out a way in a fictional sense to make it necessary for the enemy to strike now, which I did figure out, which is part of the fun of writing these things is you're aggressively solving problems on the written page the same way I would have on the battlefield. But if I mess it up on the written page, it's okay. No one's coming home in a body bag. But that was the problem I had. I got to that point and kind of red selling this from the outside. That's what I came up with. Like, just watch for a little while longer. Watch us fight inside.
You do not need to assume that the Chinese or the Russians or any other or the Iranians or any other extraneous actor owns or is manipulating some player in US politics, right? You just have to see that they're looking at us and just gently nudging, both sides to get people to be more aggressive to each other and help to tear us down. And frankly, they've got a lot of assistance from elites, right, in the US. And one of my questions in my mind, and it's an open question, is whether a country can survive when its own elite seems to hate it, right? I was really struck by the meeting that just happened up in Alaska between our State Department and the Chinese, where the Chinese launched this blistering attack on the US, and every one of their talking points came out of the editorial pages of the New York Times, right? So, like, what do you do when your own leaders and your own sort of quote unquote elites, legacy media, let's say, are pushing a narrative that's the same narrative that the adversary is? Well, you flip that around. The adversary doesn't need to make up their own stuff. They just replay what the New York Times is already saying, right? Or CNN is already saying. And that's a technique. Again, it's a recognized information warfare technique developed by the Russians during the Cold War. It's not some nefarious, weird thing. It's, you can read academic books on it that were written 20 years ago. So, that's the thing I think we have to be worried about. The other thing I would just comment on with respect to 2020 is, as you guys know, and I'm sure you've talked about it with others on the podcast, there's been a debate about the origins of COVID. I do not have any more knowledge than anyone else does, but certainly looking at it sort of a Bayesian, best fit of all the data that we have available, I've always felt like the best fit theory was an accidental leak from a lab, right? I don't at all discount the sort of, what they call zoonotic origin, animal origin, but certainly there's elements about it that suggest to me that it might have been an accidental lab leak. I'm not one of those guys who thinks it was a deliberate Chinese bioweapon, right? But having said that, China's got one of the most active biowarfare programs on the planet. They have actively engaged in human performance enhancement with a variety of military objectives. The first major military group they sent to Wuhan after the outbreak of the flu was from their biowarfare command. And look at what's happened over the last 12 months. USS Eisenhower was essentially out of action for about 6 weeks. Anderson Air Force Base on Guam was massively disrupted for a couple of months. The French aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, got knocked out of action for a couple of months as well. The effect of that virus on not just the Western economy, but on particularly maritime and air assets had a huge impact. And I would just suggest that if the Chinese biowarfare guys are not currently right now studying this and saying, hey, if that's what we could achieve with an accidental release of a non-weaponized pathogen, imagine what we could do with a deliberate release of something that was tailored for, particular effect. Then they're guilty of military malpractice if they're not doing that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I think the next time this happens, we're going to be dealing with adversaries who have learned a lot, not just about masks and vaccination and lockdowns, but about how to weaponize stuff in a way that generates the most disruptive effect on already polarized Western societies. So this is if it wasn't in the repertoire of our adversaries a year ago, it absolutely is now, and I think it's something to be thinking about very hard as we go forward.
Oh, absolutely. That's as I was writing this book, with the basis being what the enemy has learned by watching us on the field of battle. Well, I start writing this and then COVID hits. So being in the enemy's shoes, I have to go, okay, what are they learning from our response to COVID? So that makes its way into the novel. Then we hit a summer of civil unrest. Once again, they're not just looking at that and with passing interest, seeing it on a headline and then going on to their next thing. They're learning from that. And then we have a very contentious political season, an election cycle. Of course, they're learning from that. So as I'm writing, this novel becomes, I had no idea in 2019 when I outlined it, that 2020 was going to be such a pivotal year in the history of this country and the world. But the enemy was learning from those things, and it just became natural for me to weave those in to the storyline. And in researching the bioweapons side of the house, I had no touch points with that while I was in the military. But in doing this research in academic journals and in just chapters and books here and there, interviews with people, and the interviews was fascinating because it's the first time that I think I did what maybe a journalist would do in talking to one source, and then they leave out something because they don't want to tell you everything. But then you talk to somebody else that does a similar thing, they leave something out, but it's what the other guy put in. So then you get to weave this thing together and put these puzzle pieces together, which is what I did for the novel here. But the enemy is certainly learning by watching us over this last year and
absolutely
incorporating these lessons into their battle plans.
And I will just say it's a feature of American political discourse and the way we like to think about ourselves that we think we were just uniquely sucky, right, at dealing with COVID. We were terrible. Our response was horrible. Actually, if you look at it, US was in the middle of the pack. European nations did really badly. A lot of places in Africa and South America and Southeast Asia have really struggled. A few notable countries, Taiwan, Hong Kong initially, but not lately, Australia, New Zealand, have done well on a health standpoint, but everyone screwed up something. Everyone suffered. And I think we can sort of be a little bit narcissistic sometimes and say, well, we're just uniquely bad. And it's just not true, right? And I think we need to sort of give ourselves a bit of credit sometimes that, perhaps the US is not as evil and satanic and systemically bad as people tend to think it is.
Yeah, no, I agree. And forgiveness is a very powerful tool as well. And no matter what you're dealing with, whether it's personal or professional.
Totally.
But I'm with you on the accidental release. I was on Joe Rogan's podcast where I mentioned your book, by the way, in April of last year when the last novel came out.
It's nice of you to do that, man.
Absolutely, of course. My goodness, everything's been so impactful. But we talked about that, and I said that if you were a detective and in any country in the world, and you had something happen, let's say a virus escapes in a general vicinity of a lab that does similar type research, we'd call that a clue. And you'd want to maybe ask a few questions, maybe look into that sort of thing. I mean, that's and there is precedent, of course, for labs having unintentional leaks in the former Soviet Union, in our country.
Happens all the time, and it's recognized as having happened dozens of times from Chinese labs, right? And people may not be keeping up with the Chinese sort of propaganda narrative, but they are no longer saying that it was an accidental, animal-based wet market thing. That was their original story. Now they're saying it isn't even Chinese. It came from outside. There's one story that they're pushing that says it came in frozen food from Europe to China, right? And just the stuff that's just not in any way believable. And right now the Chinese are massively smacking the Aussies with all this incredible bullying behavior on the economic front, because Canberra had the temerity to literally ask the question, hey, we would like to have an independent investigation into the origin of the Wuhan flu. So, when you're reacting that way to someone literally just asking the question, it tends to signal that you got something to hide, So, I'd be more than happy to discount the accidental lab leak if they would allow us to investigate and identify what really did happen, right? So, it's in common with many other things. People that try to stifle debate and prevent anyone from even asking the question, they don't shut down people's doubts. They just make themselves look insecure, and that can long-term, undermine their credibility. And I think that's what's happened to China. I mean, international perceptions of the Chinese have cratered in the last 12 months, in large part because of this, right, which they inflicted on the world. I mean, at the same time that China had shut down internal travel from Wuhan to everywhere else in China, they were still encouraging travelers to come into China and leave China to go to the United States and elsewhere. It was breathtakingly irresponsible behavior, right? Even if it wasn't a deliberate leak. So, I think let's just say there's questions to answer, right? And until people are held accountable, what I worry about is next time around, we won't have learned the lessons we need to protect ourselves when we get a flu that could be much more dangerous than this one.
Oh yeah. That's what we mean. That's what we owe it at the tactical level, to pass on lessons to the next group coming in, or to the military as a whole. And at the strategic level, that's what our leaders also owe us, is making the best decisions possible at that strategic level. Like you talk about understanding the nature of the conflict in which you're engaged. Well, our senior level leaders at the outset after 9/11 and when we entered Iraq, they didn't do that. They didn't put that. I mean, maybe they put the time in, but they certainly didn't take the lessons and apply those lessons moving forward as wisdom. They missed that. So in this case, we have an opportunity. We've had a full year to look back on and to look at data, to look at the decisions that were made, to see the outcomes of those decisions, and then to apply that going forward, that knowledge going forward as wisdom. So I hope that we can do that.
Yeah, and I hope we can. And take the domestic partisan politics out of it and be just like, look, we all have different political points of view, but let's figure out what really did happen, which, I have the quaint old-fashioned belief that there is such a thing as objective truth, right? And we need to try and figure that out. And, truth is whatever, to quote Philip K. Dick, right, another great author, the reality is that with which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away.
That's one.
Right? So it doesn't really matter whether you believe a particular narrative or another. It's, there's real facts, and they're going to bite you in the ass if you don't take cognizance of them.
Yeah. And going back to the frozen food coming into Wuhan, that sort of thing, it is so much, and I don't say easier is the wrong word. It's always, I try to avoid saying easier, but there are so many more options today when you're trying to manipulate a populace than there were in, say, 1955, 1965, 1975. Although over time, there become more and more ways to do it. Let's say in 1955, if you're trying to influence somebody, well, maybe you have blackmail on a reporter at the New York Times, or you pay a reporter at the New York Times to put out a story that is says what you want it to say. Well, now with this connectivity that we have with all these different platforms and ways to communicate, influencers who don't do their research, that don't put the time, energy, and effort into the study of history, they a lot easier to manipulate a populace today. So I think if you understand that, and if you take a breath as a citizen and realize that that's out there, that those forces are at play, and you are probably being manipulated today, because there are so many more ways to do it than there were 30, 40, 50 years ago. The manipulation's still at work, but there are more ways to reach you almost continuously all day, every day, if you're connected.
It's one of the sources I quoted in my book described it as a fire hose of falsehood, right?
Wow.
Just this continuous stream of bullshit that you get from all sides, and it's incredibly difficult. I'm a trained intelligence officer, and I still have trouble figuring out how to grade different sources in terms of, access, placement, accuracy, intent to manipulate, all those kinds of things. And, I would love to live in a world where you didn't have to apply analytical tradecraft to the mass media, but unfortunately that's not the world we live in, right? You do have to sift through this stuff. And, I often, because I do a lot of work in places like Africa and Latin America, I have personal first-hand knowledge from stuff on the ground. And I often find when I'm reading, the mainstream media, the bits that I know well, I'll be like, yeah, that ain't right, and that's not true, and that isn't correct. And then when I go to the next thing, I'm like, well, how do I know that they are any more accurate on this other stuff than on the stuff that I know, where I know they're not accurate?
Trust. It's all about that trust. And right now we have very little trust in our media. And I think, I think either it's Pew Research polling or it's Rand Corporation studies, but I think trust in the United States government was at an all-time high right around 1962, 63, somewhere in there. It went to an all-time low, although I haven't checked recently, right around 1979, 80, right about that time in the Carter administration. I would venture,
apart from now, right?
Yeah, exactly. I would venture that today we're probably in that same area as far as trust in government, trust in our institutions, trust in our media.
I think we've actually gotten to a place where there's been this kind of collapse of confidence in elites and experts and institutions of all kinds. And look, mate, I mean, you and I are not guiltless here, right? Because part of this is the military, because we've spent 20 years chasing little non-state actors around Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and, all these other places. And the mass media and so-called experts keep on telling the American people, we've got the best military that has ever existed. There's never been anything like it. Best military in history. And at the same time, they can see with their own eyes that we just can't close the deal, right? In Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. And at some point, people start to go, hey, you so-called experts, you're all full of shit.
Right.
And I think that's, it's part of a bigger pattern, right? It applies to every aspect of society, but I think we have our part in that too. And that's why we've got to be upfront about what we know, what we don't know, because I think that there's only so much more of this that we can take before society really starts to come apart at the seams.
Oh yeah, no, at the tactical level, like we're pretty good at kicking in those doors. We're pretty good at that level. But we're talking about something besides that. And then you have a great chapter in here where you reference Rise and Kill First. Which is
Ronan Bergman, great Israeli journalist. Really good,
amazing book. And he had The Secret War with Iran is another one of his books. I used both of those in research for my last novel as well. But you reference him in that exact context as far as what the Israelis did, particularly in the 80s and up through like 2002, and seeing how their tactical level pursuit and targeted assassination program, took a lot of people off the battlefield, very successful. But the enemy in turn, now we're having more attacks because everything speeds up, that process speeds up. So is that successful strategically? So we have that same problem in our country.
Totally. And, in that part of the book where I talk about the sort of adaptation of evolution of Hezbollah and the Palestinian groups, I also quote this great documentary, which if people have an opportunity to watch it, I strongly recommend. It's called The Gatekeepers. And basically a couple of Israeli filmmakers interviewed all the surviving heads of the Shin Bet, which is Israel's internal security service. And one of them, who I quote in the book, said, look, we were killing all these guys, but it was point specific. It was all tactics, no strategy, right? And I think you could apply the same lessons to us. I would just say that at the military level, sort of military instrument of power, as we say in the business, really the US is unparalleled, right? I mean, I have been counting 7 or 8 counterinsurgency or irregular warfare campaigns that I've personally fought in. I've worked with 17 different militaries. I've never seen a military that's better at the tactical level at defeating an irregular adversary than the US military. The problem is not that the military can't defeat the adversary. The problem is that the nation can't take that military success and then translate it into a peace that serves our objectives, right? So it's like we just can't close the deal. You think about Afghanistan, we've repeatedly defeated the Taliban in battle, probably 4 or 5 times, right? The guys we're fighting today in Afghanistan are sons of or younger brothers of guys that we killed 10 years ago or 15 years ago. We're in the sort of Taliban 5.0 at this point. Every time we defeat them on the battlefield, they recuperate, and we just can't seem to politically and diplomatically come up with a solution. So frankly, the military's done a great job in reforming itself and trying to improve. But if the problem's not a fundamentally military problem, well, that's not going to help us, right? And I think the problem really lies in us as a nation and the way we think about war and the way that so few of our leaders have any direct experience of it. There's great Congress people like Mike Waltz or Alyssa Slotkin who have, combat experience in Afghanistan and Iraq or served in the CIA as elicited, but they're a rare exception, right? And the majority of these people are, octogenarians who manage to avoid any form of military service in their very long lives. And it's all theory to them, and it is not theory to our adversaries. Yeah. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, snatching that defeat from the jaws of victory again. And so I want to be cognizant of your time because I didn't get to one of my questions. I wrote down a bunch. I didn't get to one of them. So we're going to have to do this again at some point. And now I want to talk about Mumbai. I want to talk about a whole bunch of different things. But because we did touch on China, I love when you talk about in the book, your most recent book, when you're sitting at the Hotel del Coronado having a cocktail. And because I thought from before my first day stepping on the quarterdeck at SEAL Team 5 was I looked up and the Hotel Del's a little farther down, but right there, when you look up from the grinder for this big open area where you lay out all your gear, get ready to go on deployment or training trips, you look up and you see these things called the shores, which are, I think they were built in the 70s. It looks like 1970 style architecture, kind of an eyesore, but these very tall buildings right on the waterfront that look, guess where, directly down at WARCOM. So the command that controls all the SEALs. And then SEAL Team 5, SEAL Team 3, SEAL Team 1. And I always thought, I bet China's up there. I bet Russia is up there. Somebody's renting out some of these floors up there that have some sophisticated listening devices, and they're pointing right down here at this compound. You can catch so much just in crosstalk walking across the compound.
Totally.
And you
sit there at the Hotel Del. You're in one of the most dense concentrations of naval power anywhere on the planet. I just sketch out just a tiny, unclassified portion of what that is in the book. Someone who read the book said to me, well, okay, this doesn't make any sense, right? Because the Chinese have satellites, they've got aircraft, and they've got the ability to do this stuff remotely without having to put somebody on the ground. My response to that was twofold. One, sometimes you just have to have a person on the spot, right? That's why we still have a CIA, even after we have all this other stuff. And sometimes there's just no substitute for actually being there. But the other thing to be aware of is space warfare, right? And it doesn't make any sense to create a ground listing post when you've got space assets unless you're planning to knock those space assets out, right? And what we see now is the Chinese and the Russians talking about building a joint permanent moon base by 2027. We've got China building a rival platform to the International Space Station. Last September, China put the final touches to the Beidou system, which is their equivalent to GPS, which now goes globally. And, both China and Russia have weaponized space to the point where, people perhaps don't realize just quite how much modern civil society and economies depend on GPS. And at some point, if you can turn that off, you can massively disrupt not only the US military, but basically every aspect of modern society in most of the West. Of course, if they do that to us, we are going to retaliate to them in space. They've clearly thought ahead of that, and they're starting to build ground assets to enable them to still function even in the event of space being knocked out. It's really important to kind of think outside the box of that modern, let's call it the Apple family of devices that everyone walks around with, to realize that that stuff's a hell of a lot easier to put an end to than we like to think.
Oh yeah, and all anybody has to do to figure out how important GPS is to our daily lives is to try to get somewhere, give someone directions somewhere without sending them a Google Map or an Apple Map link. Yeah,
Totally.
it's.
I just got done running a resistance warfare course for a bunch of U.S. government folks, and one of the hardest of all the things that people have to do in that environment is figure out, again, how to navigate without some electronic device that's continually pinging their location and, with a components made in China, that you're driving around with, and the ability to like dump your electronics and still function in an off the grid manner. That's hard for us, but it's second nature to most of the guys we're fighting, So I think part of it is that old school element, having like 2 or 3 really important bits of gear that you can rely on, that are going to be there when the chips are down, that you can trust, and trying to, I always say more skill, less equipment, and if you have the better skills, you can do more with less, but we've become very kind of, prisoners of our own gadgets at some level, I think.
Big time. Not just on the intelligence side of the house or the special operations side of the house, but just as citizens in general, as far as being self-reliant and responsible and all those other things. So I know I've kept you longer than we said, and I sincerely appreciate you taking time to do this. And once again, I did not get to any of my questions here, but I want to do this again when you have time. But before we go, I was thinking of, as I was zipping back through these novels or these books here, and I was just thinking about having seen you for a while and thinking about everything that has happened since we last met up. I was looking for a little hope, because when I am looking at our domestic situation here in the United States, I'm looking at COVID, I'm looking at civil unrest, I'm looking at these what seem to be, if you were the enemy looking in, almost irreconcilable political differences. When we talk about empires, and I like the how you framed this, and this is why I ask it in terms of hope, because you do talk about it almost in terms of hope in the novel. When we talk about the decline of an empire, and we talk about I think you call it a culminating point, maybe Iraq, March 2003. We look back at that as that was the culminating point where we started our decline as an empire, as a military. When you look at all this, and having put the time you have on the ground, everything that you've seen, everything that you have studied, everything that you have written, and then seen politicians maybe squander, perhaps, what gives you hope going forward when you look at this nation, of which you are now a citizen? Are we on the decline as an empire, or is there hope out there where we can continue to go forward and get stronger as a nation?
Well, it's kind of both, right? I mean, I think if you want to preserve the American quote unquote empire as it existed in the middle of the 1990s, when the US was, to use Madeleine Albright's term, the indispensable nation, and you think that we're going to be the sort of global hegemon, to use that term, forever, then I have bad news for you, right? We are not going to probably ever get back to where we were in the 1990s. And I do think we're in a multipolar environment where we have real serious peer rivals who are, posing a much greater threat than anything you and I dealt with during our active military careers. So I think, if you want hope that we're going to get back to that, Clintonian era, it's not going to happen, right? But I would offer a different kind of hope, which is people still are people. People believe in freedom. People believe in free enterprise, in free speech, in family, in traditional values. And you can only push people so far before you get people calling bullshit on that and saying, no, I'm not prepared to walk around in sackcloth and ashes and just decide that my day is done and America is busted. And I think we're already seeing that pushback. We're also seeing it in Europe. We're seeing it elsewhere. I also think people are realizing that a lot of the racial stuff and the class stuff that's going on is people deliberately trying to set Americans of different skin colors and of different social classes against each other. And rather than being manipulated into fighting each other, we need to step back and go, hey, we're not, the other Americans we're talking about are not the enemy, and I hear people saying that. I believe, that there is hope in that sense. And I guess this is a slightly dark point of view, but who wants to live in a world where every problem is solved, right? I mean, that's just the definition of boring as far as I'm concerned, right?
Yeah, we'll never get there, but
why did humans rise from, the savannah of Africa 270,000 years ago to be where we are now? It was facing challenges, right? Lethal challenges. And, I had to break it, you know better than anyone. We're all going to die, right? At some point. And it's how you go, right? And it's how you face the challenges that makes a difference. And I think ultimately, a life well lived is what matters most. And I think all those opportunities are still out there, regardless of what's happening, inside the Beltway or on CNN or at Nike. There's a real world out there with plenty of challenges. And I think that getting, engaged in that is the way to, unlock that hope.
I love it. I think we'll leave it at that because I've kept you longer than I said I would. And
no worries, man.
I sincerely appreciate you doing this. And I know you're not on the social channels. You are very wisely these days. I think you were on Twitter for like a second or two years and years ago.
I have a Twitter account. I never use it. I just don't have time, man.
I get it.
You know better than anyone. I just totally suck at email, right? I'm that bad at even responding to emails. I couldn't write books and do field work and run a company and all that if I was also on Twitter all day. I just don't have time.
I get it. How people do it. So that's a loss for the rest of us, but very wise decision on your part. These books right here, absolutely fantastic. Can't recommend them highly enough to everybody. I'd say, usually I would tell people to go in order, but because of the Dragons and the Snakes and just how timely this is, and was to me when I read it last year, I'd say people jump in with this one, then go through the rest. Because
the other book that I think people might like is called Blood Year, and it's about the rise of ISIS.
Yep, right here.
And it's a bit less academic, a bit more of a narrative.
Yeah, right there. So
my Oxford University Press appreciates you.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that one right there. I want to talk to you about this one for sure next time around.
Well, let's do it again, man. I'm sure that stuff is going to happen that'll bring things up we can talk about.
That one right there. Yeah. And I want to go through all these with you, but hopefully we'll see each other in person before too long. And it's always hard to keep track of you because you're always zipping around the world, and I'll get some sort of a text on a different type of platform, and you'll be somewhere, in some jungle, in some desert, in some urban environment that doesn't seem too safe to me. And hopefully we'll link up here and be able to grab some drinks soon.
And then we'll do it over a Colorado bourbon.
Perfect.
At some point.
Welcome to the Gear Highlights section of the Danger Close podcast. And because I had my friend Dr. David Kilcullen on this podcast, I wanted to talk about his books a little bit more. I talked about them quite a bit during the podcast, but every student of warfare needs to have these books, not just in their library, but they need to be read. They need to be highlighted. They need to be revisited. I can't stress that enough. And if you're not signed up for my reading list selections every month, I have a reading list selection that comes out. You can sign up for my newsletter on the blog section of my website there. And each month I take 6. And some of those are books that come from the professional reading list that I was asked to put together for the Naval Special Warfare Center before I left the SEAL teams. And others are books that influenced me on some way along my journey. And I'll tell you what, these books have all influenced not just me, but an entire generation of combat leaders. And David Kilcullen is the main driving force behind that impact and that influence. So, get these books. Can't recommend them enough. The Dragons and the Snakes. When I sat down to write The Devil's Hand, I jumped right into this book, and this really helped focus me along the path as I was putting that book together, as I was putting myself in the enemy's shoes, looking back on particularly the last 20 years and what they've learned by watching us on the field of battle for those last 20 years. So David Kilcullen does that in this book at a strategic and tactical level for those who are interested, which should be everybody, because going forward, we have some challenges ahead, as we discussed in the podcast. So the Dragons and the Snakes, definitely pick this up. Usually I tell people to start at the beginning with Accidental Guerrilla, but I think jump in with this one because it is so timely. So the Dragons and the Snakes, and for sure pick up Counterinsurgency. And this one right here goes into the background behind the 28 articles of counterinsurgency, which we talked about on the podcast. So once again, required reading for students of war. Blood Year for sure. You can see all these. I don't even know why I highlight them because the whole book ends up being highlighted. So Blood Year, Out of the Mountains. I'm actually quoted in here, which was such an honor for me. And we're going to talk about each and every one of these books, I hope, in separate podcasts going forward, because there's so much to talk about. And The Accidental Guerrilla right here. So amazing work. David, thank you so much for writing these. And on the podcast, we talk about a couple other books. Rise and Kill First, which if you've been following along, influenced me as I wrote The Devil's Hand. So as you can tell, those yellow stickies again. This is another book that ended up getting quite a few highlights here. So absolutely fantastic. We talked about the Counterinsurgency Field Manual, his involvement with this. So also, although some parts of it things have evolved quite a bit because the enemy, as we talked about on the podcast, is always adapting. We're always adapting to the enemy. They're always adapting to us. So this should be in everyone's library as well. And what I didn't get to ask David about, because I didn't get to any of my questions because we just started talking, is unrestricted warfare here. And this one really is I think it's a paper that was written by two Chinese military officers, I think around 1999. I might be wrong with that date, 98, 99, somewhere. But in the US, it says 2002 right here, but it was written earlier than that. But I want to talk to him about this, about how this was interpreted in the United States, and some of the, I think some things we can learn from this. So we'll talk about that next time. And when David was talking about how he created those 28 articles of counterinsurgency, well, he was at the Starbucks in the Pentagon, and it happened because somebody had another meeting and they couldn't make it to meet him. So he took out his black moleskin notebook and he wrote those down. So a notebook just like this one. So I always have a notebook with me no matter where I go, always writing down those notes, those ideas, usually as they pertain to future novels these days. But I've graduated from this size to this size. This one from Sig. Thank you, Sig. But I love this. So each and every book gets its own notebook like this. So I have one for each of the novels thus far, and this one is going to be for this fifth novel that I'm writing. I have all sorts of notes in here, and very cool. This pen right here, Kelly Slayton. So he's at Kelly Slayton on Instagram and at Palmetto Patriot Flags. But this pen, awesome. Thank you for making this pen. It means a lot to me. And this is the one that's going to take a ton of notes here as I get deeper and deeper into writing and the edits for book 5, Title Classified. So sincerely appreciate that. Thank you so much. And in these these books here, obviously Osama bin Laden is mentioned, Al-Qaeda is mentioned. There's a lot of information about that terrorist organization and how it's evolved from, I think their first meeting was, in 1988. You can fact check me on that, but so much has happened over the years, obviously. But this right here, this is from my friend James Yeager, and this is the original wanted poster for Osama bin Laden. You can see the U right there because you see that he's called UBL when you're talking about him, not OBL. So this is the U spelling right there. Wanted by the FBI, murder of U.S. nationals outside of the United States, conspiracy to murder U.S. nationals outside the United States, attack on a federal facility resulting in death. And the date on this thing is March 29th, 1999. So James Yeager at Tactical Response, thank you so much for sending this. That means a lot to me that you'd send this to me. Sincerely appreciate it, my friend. So there we go. I think that's everything. All right. Get reading. Thank you for tuning in to the Danger Close podcast, an Ironclad original presented by 6 Hour. For more on David Kilcullen, you can pick up his books wherever books are sold. The Dragons and the Snakes, Counterinsurgency, Blood Year, Out of the Mountains, and The Accidental Guerrilla. And I'll have to have him back on the podcast soon because he is such a treasure trove of information and knowledge, but more importantly, of wisdom. And if you enjoyed the podcast, be sure and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you watch your podcasts, on Apple, Spotify, or on YouTube. And I'll see you next time on Danger Close.